Welcome to CRT. I'm Bambi Francisco Roizen. I'm speaking with John Pittard. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion at Yale Divinity School. His focus is primarily in epistemology and philosophy of religion. He's also done a lot of work in the intersection of AI and religion. Specifically, he's asking these days, can AGI, artificial general intelligence, have moral standing? In other words, can AGI have a conscience and be considered a conscious being that knows wrong from right? He writes about that in his essay, Artificial General Intelligence, Moral Standing and Attenuated Relationality. So we'll be talking a lot about that work. John, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here with you.
Welcome all the way from Connecticut. So before we dive into AI, I want to just have you talk a little bit about your faith journey. Just interested in whether you were, raised with a faith, or that just happened to something you were seeking when you were older. I'm always curious about people's journey.
Yeah, so I was raised in a Christian home. I was raised with uh, going to church every Sunday, actually twice on Sundays, once on Wednesday, but also with a mother who was kind of very conventionally faithful, I'd say, not thoughtfully, but kind of straightforward convictions about the authority of the Bible and stuff like that, and a father who was very skeptical and wrestling and challenging those who were in the faith community that we went to. And so I think without being able to name philosophy as a subject I was interested in, just that divergence of views in my own household probably prompted some philosophical interests and philosophical conversations as I navigated the undercurrents of these sorts of disagreements, even though they were both within Christian community. So in undergraduate, I studied economics and didn't study philosophy, didn't study theology, but started getting really interested in it in my college years. I studied economics at Harvard, but had friends in the philosophy department, and certainly was active talking with them and thinking about faith issues. And I had, like a lot of people do in those college years, really um, kind of urgent times of trying to figure out what I believed and what I wanted to commit to and didn't want to commit to. Came out of that time interested in faith, excited about faith, but it wasn't until I was a very brief time as a management consultant that I thought, actually the thing I was really getting passionate about at the end of college, I am not able to devote as much time to, and I want to study it more seriously and academically. And so I went to seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary, and it was a rich time. And it was there that I sort of eventually started to find that I was drawn towards philosophical questions about God, about my faith, and even in non-philosophy classes, ended up essentially writing philosophy papers. And so it was a very indirect, long journey to become a philosopher. And it was finally very late in my time at Princeton Seminary where I thought maybe I should study philosophy and be sort of at home methodologically in the way I think and I'm inclined to tackle problems. And so, you know, I found my way to philosophy of religion, but philosophy more broadly, and somehow landed this job at Yale Divinity School where I get to both teach philosophy, full time. That's my job, but also a lot of philosophy of religion. I mean, that's primarily what I'm hired to do. And so a lot of philosophers who are interested in philosophy of religion, maybe it's something they write about a lot, but they may not get to teach on it as much as I do. So I'm grateful to be at a place where the the questions that originally brought me into philosophy are the questions that I get to focus my teaching on.
Now, as a teacher of philosophy of religion, does that also include apologetics? Because you would have to understand different worldviews.
It's certainly related to apologetics. So apologetics would normally be defined as, defending the faith. And obviously, philosophy can be highly relevant there. I think of them as quite different approaches and disciplines. If like, someone was teaching apologetics, then their principal aim would be to help those in the class find uh, effective ways of defending their faith commitments.
Mm.
And a philosopher is interested in asking hard questions and grappling with problems and understanding them, regardless of whether it's going to serve some sort of apologetic enterprise. I mean, it might make apologetic enterprise more difficult, right? It might be that you start to appreciate and recognize problems that maybe with your own commitments, say, that maybe aren't problems for other people. It's not like it would be apologetically useful to expose those problems, work them out, tackle them, think through them. But as a philosopher, I think that's exactly what you need to do, right? Is you need to kind of explore those problems honestly in a way that kind of holds you accountable to philosophical standards, whether or not that serves some sort of apologetic interest. So it's obviously related. Apologetics often draws on arguments that we might also talk about in a philosophy of religion class. But yeah, I approach the questions as a philosopher. The classrooms are, it's a philosophy classroom. So, if someone feels comfortable in their convictions, I'd like them to experience some of the discomfort that I think is appropriate to philosophy to understand how hard a lot of these questions can be and how open-ended some of them are.
Oh, that's great then. I mean, because you're really chiseling the apologist, right? I mean, that's what they have to go through. They,
Yeah, if I'm sure there are, I mean, there's no clean break between apologetics and philosophy in a sense that every philosopher to some degree is defending a view, but I don't think that always needs to be their primary purpose is to try to convince someone. They're often trying to understand, but
but an apologist would, to some extent, maybe they're even, sort of undercover evangelists, right? They're really trying to.
I mean, I think that's essential to the apologetic enterprise, right? It is trying to bring up people over to the view that you hold and that you believe.
I think that, as I was telling you before we got on live, is that I am going to go back to seminary, finally go back to seminary after decades, but I think I'm still going to study apologetics. I think that's sort
Yeah.
of my at this point, that's where I want to be. I want to ask you about Yale Divinity School and just universities in general. There's a lot of discussion, national discussion around the lack of diversity in particularly Ivy League schools, but also in the rigidness in the way people view things. And it reminds me of the fissure we had between Protestants and Catholics, which is, are you saved by grace? Or are you saved by works? And that was the question that was, that really created probably the 30-year war, right? I mean, there's a lot of political elements in that, but the question today, it feels that is dividing the faith, people of faith, would be, is sex, do you believe sex is binary, the traditional view, or do you believe sex is on the spectrum? Do you find that that debate is at Yale Divinity School? Is that something that is dividing the people of faith inside the your school?
It doesn't feel like, I mean, I only have my own perspective and who I interact with and the conversations that I hear. It doesn't feel like a foregrounded issue as far as I can tell here. And maybe that's just it's a hot button topic. Maybe people are wary of getting into it without a clear payoff or something. But no, I don't feel like that is, I mean, certainly issues of gender, of sexuality, inclusion, these are all deep concerns and issues here. And so we'll play into various courses in certain ways. Um, but no, and maybe I'm just, hanging out in the wrong circles or whatever, but it doesn't feel like a central point of conflagration here, as far as I can tell.
Okay. All right, well, let's get to your paper. The paper you wrote, artificial. Did you write that in 2025? Was that in 20, or is that
It came out in 2025. Yeah, I mean, I think I drafted it early 2024, but
okay? So artificial general intelligence, moral standing, and attenuated relationality. Was it the rise of ChatGPT that got you interested in the intersection of AI and religion, or what was it that motivated you to get more involved in this intersection?
Yeah. So if I'm remembering the timeline right, I think ChatGPT came out sometime in the fall of 2023. The ChatGPT, that's when the kind of explosion of interest in AI happened. I had started thinking about these issues a bit before that, so you could play around with the GPT-3, I think it was, the before the chat interface came out with ChatGPT, and I had been uh, I guess it was 2022, right? So I had been, did I say 2023? I don't remember what I said. But in the summer of 2022, I was playing around with that. And we were doing an issue of our Reflections online magazine on the future of theological education. And I was asked, do you want to contribute something to this issue? And initially, my gut response was not really, because philosophy is very marginal in theological education. I didn't feel like it had much of a place, so I had very little to say about the future of theological education from the standpoint of a philosopher.
Mm.
But then it occurred to me, well, actually, AI raises a huge number of important questions that impinge on theology very directly. Questions about the nature of a soul, questions about what makes humanity unique, if anything, where does the value of humanity reside, and how would artificial agents fit into the kind of spiritual landscape, if at all. So then that was my first entry into writing on this. So I wrote this is a popular level piece on, um, I think I called it The Coming Religious Disruption or something like that, on artificial intelligence and the questions that religious leaders would have to grapple with and thinking about this in the future if it continued to develop. And that was the same summer, I believe, when Blake Lemoine got fired from Google after, claiming that their internal model, Lambda, was conscious.
Oh,
Um, and so it was just basically right around the time, just before, but right around the time when ChatGPT was coming on the scene when I started thinking about this and writing on its own.
got it. Okay. So let's take a dive into your paper. So there's several takeaways that I have. Um, I read it, but I also had ChatGPT summarize it, so I'm just truth be told.
Nice.
Let me see. I want to see if I have this right. Basically, the paper explores whether AGI can ever have a conscience.
Or
Um,
can ever be conscious, but
or
yeah.
can ever be conscious, and
Hmm.
that we will never know. You conclude we'll never know, but it's important for Christians to understand that it's a possibility because we are made in the image of God. If we're made in his image, then in the image meaning being actively creative beings, then it's possible that we can create a conscious being out of software because this would be the highest form of being in the image of God. Is that a fair statement?
So that raises the issues that I explore. I wouldn't say the argument you just stated, I wouldn't endorse that, or I don't quite recognize, my piece in that statement of the argument. I'd say that we might separate out what's the thesis of that piece from the bigger question, in a sense of what are you hoping to accomplish with this piece. And I
Mhm.
think one thing I'm hoping to accomplish is kind of twofold. I mean, one is to just bring religious commitments into this question of the moral status of artificial intelligence. So, when I talk about the moral status of artificial intelligence, I mean, this is most likely to be relevant for future hypothetical artificial intelligence that is more human-like in its capacities for agency or for sorts of general intelligence. And if we succeed in developing such technologies, we'll have this question of, are these technologies that are deserving of moral respect, moral concern? Can they flourish? Can they suffer? And a lot of people are beginning to talk about these questions, but typically, at least in the academy and in industry, religion just doesn't factor into that conversation. But this is one question where I think if you have religious convictions, it should and will very much shape how you think about the possibility of artificial machines with moral standing or artificial machines that have subjective experience that are conscious in some way. And we could talk more about what these terms mean. And so, one thing I want to do is just highlight. Actually, this is a really relevant factor. It's not generally talked about. Generally, the conversation is carried out with essentially atheistic or naturalistic kind of assumptions. But if many, many people believe in God or have specific religious commitments, then if we want to build consensus on this question, if we want to think as a society about this question, we're going to have to think about how religious convictions bear on the question of the moral status of artificial agents. So that's in a way kind of the mission of the paper to the wider academic industrial complex that's thinking about these things. My other kind of aim for those who are religious is I think many who are religious are just dismissive, certainly Christians, in this paper specifically dealing with Christian perspectives. Many are just dismissive of the possibility that machines could be conscious, that machines could be worthy of moral respect, that we could have moral obligations to them. And they may be right, ultimately. I mean, I don't firmly disagree with that view, but I think that it's too quick. And I
Mhm.
think that it hasn't properly wrestled with the different dimensions of the question, even from a theological or Christian standpoint. And so, what I'm trying to do is point to some factors that might should lead Christians to be uncertain about this on both sides of the question, and then grapple with what are the implications of that uncertainty. What are the ethical implications of it?
Right. No, I hear you. So bringing the religious questions into this process of AGI getting more intelligent and making decisions that potentially could be have some sophisticated moral component to it. It's typically addressed from a naturalistic or scientific, more naturalistic view than a theistic view. But if you're going to be a Christian and view this from a theistic view, let's not discount the probability that God may want us to create a something with consciousness, or that we have.
Might want us to create, or just might have set up the universe in such a way that it's possible for us to create conscious machines. Just because it's possible, of course, doesn't mean that God wants it, but it might mean that
Yeah.
God had good reasons to design the world in such a way that consciousness could arise not only in biological creatures, but also in machines, that are silicon based.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that then, because in Genesis 1:28, um, God says, God blesses man and women
Hmm.
he created and said, be fruitful and multiply. So when I think of creation and creation of a sentient being with consciousness, I see it in the Bible. It is in the Bible nowhere outside of procreation. It only happens through
Hmm.
procreation. And I'm wondering where in the Bible would it even suggest that God endowed us with this ability and power to create a conscious being. And I'm open to,
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah. So, I think the question, like, presumably, I think most of us think animals, some non-human animals are conscious, right? So there's something that it feels like to be my dog. Um, and so we might want to separate out the question of consciousness, the ability to suffer and flourish, which often goes along with consciousness. Consciousness is just the ability to feel things, to have experiences, really. Um,
Be
and
embodied.
Well, I mean, it's certainly related to the question of embodiment, or to embody to body as an embodiment, because we're embodied conscious beings. But there are things maybe that have bodies that aren't conscious. Plants, right? I mean, most people would think plants aren't conscious. It's debatable, but they have a body. I guess we don't normally call it a body, but you could. They're
Form.
physical, yeah, they're physical organic entities. Maybe some animals aren't conscious, lower animals perhaps. They have bodies. Um, Human beings, we know because we're human, we know we're conscious, we have experiences that we know from the inside. We are um, bodies, we're embodied beings, but it seems like we're not just our bodies, that we have these experiences that aren't easily understood as just bodily properties, even the properties of some brain doing amazing things. There's these experiences that go along with it. It's not just computations happening in my skull. It seems there's understanding, there's experiencing beauty, there's all this stuff. And so, one question is, when and where does consciousness arise in the universe, and why? And if it arises any time that there is this physical entity that's capable of certain sorts of, say, cognitive functions, capable of navigating the world in a certain way and doing certain things, that could have been the way that God determined, that consciousness should arise in the world. Anytime there's a creature that's capable of certain sorts of functions, then there will be conscious experience that goes along with those functions. That's certainly one way God could have done it. Um, and if God did it that way, right? If God said, here's how conscious experience and minds are going to be related to bodies and to things going on in the physical world, that when you have a physical system that is capable of certain sorts of has certain sort of cognitive capacities, then there will be consciousness that goes along with it. If that were just the kind of story, then if we were able to create artificial entities that were capable of those processes, had the relevant functions, then those would also be conscious, if that's how God set things up. I mean, is that like giving us, it's not giving us some magical power to, imbue consciousness on something, but it would just be us building things which, given the laws that God has set up, are then capable of conscious experience. Um, so it's certainly not something that, Genesis doesn't really answer this question of exactly which things are conscious and what are the requirements for consciousness. Um, it does suggest that creation is God's handiwork, and that human beings occupy a very special role in that, right? That we have the image of God. Um, but um, it doesn't really settle this question of what things are conscious.
Yeah, in fact, I think that the word conscience is only in the New Testament. I may be wrong. It's mentioned 29 times. And here's the thing about conscience and what Paul writes. It requires the heart because the laws in Romans 2:15, the laws are written on our hearts, and the conscience bears witness. In 9:1, Romans 9:1, the conscience confirms what's right and wrong based on the laws in our heart through the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So the laws are written in our hearts. Our conscience determines what's right and wrong through the confirmation by the Holy Spirit. So I guess my question is, AI and software has to have a heart. Now, maybe you can code some sort of something replication. And maybe the Holy Spirit is the coder behind the scenes who is giving them moral, but not to be epistemically arrogant, but I just don't see AI having either a
Yeah.
heart or.
Yeah. So just to be clear, we should distinguish two words that often get confused but mean different things. So conscience and consciousness. Um, so conscience would be a moral sense, right? The inner conviction of what's right and wrong, that guides one's moral deliberation and moral action. Um, Consciousness, as I'm using the term in the paper, is the presence of subjective experience. So, as one philosopher, Thomas Nagel, put it, if something is conscious, just in case there's something that it's like subjectively to be that thing, or something that it feels like to be that thing, is usually how I like to describe it. So, um, you know, uh, a mouse, I would guess, doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't have moral concepts. It doesn't have any sense of right and wrong, but there still might be something that it feels like to be a mouse, right? So a mouse might be able to feel hungry, feel afraid, feel some pleasure. So the mouse would be conscious. There would be something that it's like to be a mouse, but it might not have a conscience. So it's lacking something that human beings who are also conscious have, this moral sense.
Mm.
Um, Importantly, though, um, you know, on my view, and it's a popular view in philosophy, an entity can only suffer or flourish if it's conscious. It has to be able to feel things, right? To have
Right.
pleasure, pains, desires, all these things that go into our suffering and flourishing. So consciousness is required for that. But often we care about things. We have certain moral obligations to things, even if they're not morally sophisticated beings. So, you know, it I have moral obligations, I think, to my dog, to care for her and
Yeah.
and not to treat her poorly. And that's because she's conscious, I think. She can feel things, she can suffer, she can feel pain, she can feel afraid. I don't think, or I'm not, I would doubt that my dog has any kind of moral reflectivity or has a conscience, right? So even if AI was incapable of understanding morality and having a moral sense, we might say, or a conscience, we still might have obligations to AI to tend to its suffering or flourishing if it was conscious in a way that enabled it to suffer or flourish, right? I mean, we might not have the same sort of obligations we have to a human being. We might not want to show it the same sort of respect. It would be a separate question of kind of, does AI achieve the relevant moral and spiritual status that a human being can have? And maybe part of that would be this conscience idea. Is the AI kind of capable of moral reflection? And so that would be a further question, in a sense, from the question of consciousness.
I'm assuming that you think that's a far bigger hurdle for software to achieve than consciousness.
Well, it depends what you mean by bigger. I mean, I think consciousness may be impossible for software to achieve. I mean, part of what I'm arguing in the essay is just like, if you're a Christian, then I think you should think, look, which things are conscious is really up to how God set up the world. And we don't have full access to that. Even if we take on board scripture and theology, there's no passage in the Bible that says, oh, and here's the laws of consciousness where God determined which things are conscious and which things aren't. That's just not there. And so it might be just impossible, right, for a non-biological thing to be conscious given the way that God has set up the world. I mean, maybe God has confined consciousness to the biological realm. So in some sense, it might be um, just as hard to achieve consciousness because it might not be possible at all. I think that there's a sense in which what we could have evidence for, I mean, I think for something to have conscience, to be a moral reasoner, it already has to be conscious. So of
Mhm.
course there's a sense in which um, conscience is more subject to question because it's consciousness plus, right? It's consciousness plus moral reasoning. Um, but you might think, look, if AI achieves consciousness and it has a kind of understanding, maybe you would think, well, probably then it will be capable of moral reasoning because understanding, why would its understanding be limited only to scientific facts or something? Might it understand certain truths of morality and be able to take those seriously? This is a highly contested and difficult subject, whether AIs that were conscious and were capable in some sense of understanding the world, would they also have any understanding of the moral realm in the way that human beings do? And
And
I
then
think that that's just, I could say a lot more about that, but it is a contested question.
maybe from a secular humanist view of morality, but as I understand it, talking about conscience and not conscience, the more moral conscience, not being
Right.
awake and feeling pain. But even it's linked to in First Peter 3:21, it's linked to the conversion process. So this conscience, this moral conscience has to basically, this software has to surrender to God's will. It has
Hmm.
to convert, it has to have this awakening
Mm.
and reconciliation with God, have this feeling of guilt. And will software ever be coded to have this feeling of guilt?
Yeah. Well, it might be like I don't know that it would be coded to feel guilt or something, but you might think that maybe guilt can be a natural byproduct of certain forms of understanding, right? Understanding what is fair, what is just, what is good, compassionate, nourishing, and understanding how you've fallen short of those ideals, right? That might be appreciating that, understanding that might
Sure.
be enough to feel guilt, and so
But I
I mean,
think
here's an interesting analogy raised by another philosopher. I think I quote him in this paper, but suppose that we went to another planet and there were aliens there, but they were silicon based. I'm not saying they would look just like our machines. Maybe they arose through some sort of quote natural evolutionary process, but they had different substrate, to use a philosophical word. So rather than being carbon based, they're silicon based in a way that our chips are silicon based. But otherwise, they looked a lot like, I don't know, like aliens that we might imagine in sci-fi movies. They have bodies, they move around, they have communities. They seem to have moral
it's
practices.
thing.
What's that?
Spock in Star Trek, wasn't he? Wasn't
I mean I don't know my Star Trek. I have no idea if he was. I think he was carbon based, presumably, but I'm not sure. Um, it would seem weird for us to say, no, they're not made of carbon. So clearly they don't have a soul, they don't have a conscience. At best, they're just kind of mimicking moral behavior or something. Um, and I mean that would possibly be the truth, but it would seem odd to jump to that conclusion, and it would seem like we wouldn't have theological grounds for jumping to that conclusion, I think. And so it's possible that we'll be in a situation where we similarly have entities that their physical structure is quite different than ours, right? It's set up with silicon-based chips instead of carbon-based neurons and carbon-based cells.
there?
Um, but nonetheless, seems to engage in behavior that looks very much like it's engaged in a kind of moral negotiation, moral reasoning. Um, and so, I just think that it's hard to firmly support one conclusion here. Do we know that God has set up the universe such that such entities, are impossible, or if we can create entities like that, there's definitely no moral reasoning going on or moral sensibility.
Yeah, well, I'm at the camp that I hope God doesn't want us to have that power. I'm also humbly going to accept that I don't know. But
Yeah.
one of the things that I find in the Bible is, when we talk about being having a conscience, having intelligence to do cognitive things, and then there's having a conscience to do moral things, and then there's
Hmm.
wisdom, which means you're not just rudimentary morality, but it's a sophisticated morality. That's wisdom. And
Yeah.
wisdom from the Bible, in First Corinthians, it says, wisdom is what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived. God reveals it to us by his Spirit. The person without, we receive this. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God. And the person without the Spirit cannot understand them because they are not discerned. They're discerned only through
Mm-hmm.
the Spirit. And so to me, I take solace in that and thinking there is something very divine about this idea of morality, wisdom, and being conscious, having conscious. Now I'm getting confused with the words, but
Hmm.
and it comes from the Bible, and it gives me a source of solace to know that um, that there's this is from, unless God imbues it into the machine, which I'm not sure he would do. But that's what gives me solace, that we could never have AI that has wisdom, that comes to us by God only, and man does
Yeah.
not know what it is.
Yeah. Um, do you think something like AGI is possible where we have create some machine that seems as smart as a typical human being and is able to kind of navigate the communities or the world autonomously in some sense. Like, do you think, no, that's impossible too, because that also requires this divinely given spark and spirit? Or do you think, no, that may be possible? It's just that this entity would be blind in a sense to these deeper spiritual realities because it wouldn't have, be blessed by the spirit of God.
mean, I think there's wisdom of this world, and God talks about there's wisdom of this world, and I think it can have and it will have wisdom of this world, right?
Hmm.
Input
So
from
here's the interesting thing. So suppose you think that no, we really could build AGIs, right? So like, something like Samantha in the movie Her, right? That really do seem like very sophisticated um, artificial agents navigating the world. Either the virtual world, like in Her, Samantha's, she's just software based, or maybe the physical world if robotics advance far enough. So
yeah.
one possibility is someone thinks, no, we really could have these AIs that look to be as intelligent and sophisticated in certain respects as a human being, but they just wouldn't be spiritually significant beings in the way that human beings are. They would lack a soul. They would lack this divine contact with God through God's spiritual communication to us. And so that's one view. And if some of these entities expressed interest in religion, maybe you would just see that as mimicking behavior. It's not genuine spiritual interest. If they show moral behavior or moral concern, you might think, well, they're just kind of mimicking or trying to fit into human society, but there's not genuine kind of compassion or genuine self-sacrificial morality or something like that. Um, but what's one thing that's interesting to me is that's a potential view. I don't dismiss that view by any means. You would have then a whole other set of people who don't share those religious convictions, who would have no reason to think that this entity, they would think if this entity is conscious, then this entity probably has all the same moral and spiritual significance, if we want to speak in those terms, as a human being. Um, and that's a very kind of dangerous, problematic situation for society to be in, I think, where you have these entities where there's huge divides that goes along the differences of worldviews about how to understand the significance of these, whether these are mere tools that can be treated like tools because they lack, the significance of a human being, or whether they are fully conscious, fully morally aware, and capable of appreciating morality and spirituality.
Maybe that's
And
the picture of our time.
well, that is a one that really worries me because, and this is where I think I'm worried about those who are talking about this topic and utterly ignoring the convictions of religious people and how it complicates the question. Um, Now, I will say, where I think you and I would disagree is I would sort of find it unclear whether God, even if I thought, as I do actually, that there's something spiritual about consciousness, about conscience, about our freedom. Like, I don't think these are merely physical realities, but nonetheless, even if it's something miraculous and spiritual in a sense that God has bestowed on us, it's not obvious to me that God would refrain from bestowing that on machines that have the same kind of cognitive abilities. Maybe God would say, here's a machine that is a fitting recipient of a soul, and maybe I will spiritually commune with that machine and the machine can respond to my offer of grace and all of that. I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly not assuming God would do that, but I can't rule it out. And so while I'm in that religious side of the divide here, I would be uncertain. But here, I think even I would be divided from the more secular side that wouldn't have any grounds for uncertainty at that point. They would, I think, be very confident that this is a morally significant machine.
I think they would be very confident. But here's something that you brought up in your paper where you said that you doubt that there's any empirical test that could even prove that an AGI has conscience, um, is conscious.
Right.
So if we can't establish with certainty that AGI is conscious, why should we even assume that it is conscious?
Yeah. So I don't. Um, So suppose we have what I sometimes just call morally ambiguous AGI, right? And by that I just mean we just don't know whether it's conscious, whether it's capable of suffering and flourishing, and so on. Um, there's two questions. One is sort of like, well, what do you think is most probable, right? And then the other is, for purposes of acting in the world, what assumptions do you make? And those can be different, right? I might think, maybe I only think there's a 20% chance that this thing is conscious. But that might be enough for me to say, well, look, if there's a 20% chance it's conscious, like then there's a 20% chance that by treating it as a mere tool, I'm doing something that's really, really bad, a grave injustice in that case. If I treat this and when the entity is like, no, 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 please pay attention to my needs, I'm conscious. If I just say, go to OpenAI, can you please program this so it stops complaining? And, they put some filters on that prevent it from issuing moral complaints or something. Well, if it's conscious, like that would be a grave injustice. We would be preventing it, from expressing real needs. And so one might think, look, even if it's only marginally probable that it's conscious, if you don't know, if you're unsure, the appropriate thing is to assume that it is conscious. Now that also has risks, right? I mean, major risks. And part of like one of the points of my paper is the risks are so significant on both sides here. Either
Well,
assumption could go really wrong, that it would be better not to be faced with this choice to begin with, right? And not build machines that are ambiguous in this way.
don't you think well, we're already building machines that are, I mean, I think we're plodding along, right?
Yeah, I think that's an open question, right? Like whether the current paradigm, if continues to be pushed, can result in AIs that really do kind of strike people as sophisticated cognitively as human beings. I just don't know the answer to that. There's live debate about that, whether um, the kind of standard machine learning models that are being used today are sufficient for AGI.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, I mean, so I think that that'll happen and that will move in that direction to become more sophisticated, not to the point of having or to being conscious, having a conscience, but maybe to the point of being conscious, depending on how you define that word.
Yeah,
But I think it is incumbent on us to create the right boundaries and limitations. Like for
yeah,
instance, say to the AGI, try to store as much energy as you can, to never shut down. You should have things in there that
mm,
accounts for living with other social beings, right? Sort of like the cars today. It's, they have limited moral capacity, but it's moral if you say that, look, there's humans, avoid them, or there's a tree, don't hit it.
mhm,
That's a kind of a decision of what's right and wrong in the context of driving. So I think as long as we keep it to put the boundaries around that it has to be able to shut down. I guess to me, like I'm really nervous about a computer that whose only moral code is try as much as possible to never turn off.
yeah.
um,
Yeah, no, there's a lot of ways this could go wrong in terms of how these machines behave. I suppose what I'm interested in is what could go wrong, even if they behave well, right? Even if they seem like responsible members of society, is there really any experience there? Would we then start being deferential to machines that really aren't capable of understanding because they're not conscious, they don't have any kind of experience. Um, I don't I don't think it's good for us to face these really hard questions about how to navigate relations with machines that are opaque and we don't really know whether there's something morally significant there or not. So, I would like us to steer clear, have some bright lines and steer clear of anything that would start to convince lots of people, including lots of experts, that it's conscious and worthy of the same kind of respect we might extend to a human being. I think that would be a bad thing, because I think that we ultimately wouldn't know, as I've suggested in the paper, whether it's conscious, and um, to extend it the respect of a conscious entity when it's not, um, would be bad in its own way.
I think that's a greater risk. The greater the risk of the risk of not understanding what a relationship is, having a false idea of what relationship is, community is a greater risk than not giving human rights to
Mhm.
machine.
Yeah. Do you think the latter would be a really bad outcome if indeed the machines were conscious and capable of suffering and flourishing? If we just sort of said, look, we're just going to assume as society that these are just machines, they're just tools, and we're never going to extend them any kind of rights in a sense that would assume otherwise. If we were wrong in those assumptions, do you think that would be a really bad outcome? Or do you think just those assumptions are wrong? That just, in fact, machines are only machines. They're never capable of, they will never be capable of suffering or having desires or anything like that. Uh, so I guess my question is, do you think it would be a really bad result if indeed machines were capable of suffering and having desires and interests, but we ignored them because we just thought of them as tools?
Um, so I would start with that. I'm not there yet in terms of believing
Yeah,
that machines could ever suffer uh,
yeah,
or feel that pain or ever grieve. I don't understand why they would ever be coded to even want that. I spoke with somebody who lost his son. His name is Granger Smith. He's in one of the podcasts, and he said it was like getting hit by a truck,
hmm,
losing his son. And that pain, that embodied pain that you feel when you feel that loss changes you dramatically. And I don't know how that type of suffering a machine can ever endure that, nor would they want to. And
yeah,
so I'm still not, you know,
right.
still not
Yeah, so it might also be, even if there was suffering, that it wouldn't be of the same sort or as significant or of the same scale as a human being can experience. But I suspect that if a machine suffered, it wouldn't be because a programmer sits down and says, "Oh, well, let's like program certain desires into a machine, and then let's also program grief if those desires aren't satisfied." Like that would be a sort of pernicious program. Why would you program a machine to suffer? Um, but rather, I think the suffering would just be if it was possible at all, it would be a sort of natural byproduct of just things like having uh, aims and intentions of great significance that then are thwarted or destroyed, or something like that. And so that might be a suffering that would, you know, be analogous to ours, but feel different. But it's hard to know in advance. Would it be insignificant? It might not feel like someone who's lost a child, but could it also be significant and intense in its own way? Um, but I don't think these would be things that would be programmed. I think they would rather be, you might think suffering doesn't have to be like, it's not like we have a module of our brain that's just like, here's the suffering module, and we could just remove that and we wouldn't suffer. It might just come out of a more natural, we invest ourselves emotionally, affectively in the things that we care about. And you might think suffering is a natural byproduct of having cares that are fragile, and insecure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say to the robot machine that care for this thing, your job is to care, just like a parent would care for their child. You are responsible for this. But could you ever say that that is your purpose? I mean, that comes with purpose. Is that teleology? Teleology. I'm
Hmm.
learning words
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
So that means they have to have some sort of purpose that they need to care for this
Mm.
uh other thing. and maybe even a baby, a human baby that they're a caretaker for. And so where does the loss hurt them? And why would that be coded in there that they should feel sad about that?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so one question, I mean, these gets into really complicated questions about moral psychology, and some of the questions that we might ask are, um, is our capacity, say, for grief, for sadness, for joy, are these things that are somehow essential to beings that have the kind of understanding that we have, the cognitive ability? Like as soon as you appreciate beauty, goodness, you know, does that mean that automatically you start getting these moral emotions involved? Or is it something extra that comes from our distinct human psychology that you could have those understandings, you could have desires, but just be kind of unconcerned and not care, not grieve when those desires are thwarted? And these are live debates among philosophers and others in connecting fields about why we have these moral emotions. And if you thought that the moral emotions really are these add-ons that can be separated from um, just being agents with interests, uh, then yeah, maybe I think you could have machines that are conscious, that have understanding, they even have aims, maybe given to them in their programming, but just don't have any kind of deep emotional investment. You know, maybe they have no emotional experience at all. Um, that's certainly a possibility, and I don't discount, but I'm also open to the possibility that emotional investment and the capacity for suffering, happiness, joy, and the like just comes along naturally as a byproduct of certain forms of understanding. And so if you want to say those AIs would have that understanding, then you'd have to take seriously the possibility that they also have something like our moral emotions.
is that a naturalist view? Isn't that very kind of like a faith-based view then that you would say that it would just, by naturally, it would naturally exist. It seems like a belief that it would naturally exist, just like I believe in that God naturally created us to suffer. We were born
Hmm.
to suffer. Why? Because God says so. And it sort of sounds like that's what a naturalist would say because it's just the way it is, the natural law of things. It almost seems very faith-based as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, if you're confident here on any of these questions, there's probably going to be points where it's faith in the sense that you're going beyond what you can um, conclusively support, right, on arguments. So, um,
Yeah, I heard, who did I hear? It was might have been a Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson conversation where somebody said, "Oh, there you are, throwing out the Jesus card. If you don't have the answer, just throw out the
mm,
Jesus said so." So anyway, it makes it a lot easier to I guess feel convicted if you say, well, Jesus said so, as opposed to trying to have a real rational view or answer. But I am starting to think a lot about just I've been going through Romans this summer, and now I'm in Corinthians, and Corinthians is definitely tells you about the folly of this world. So it is funny to
mm,
think that I need to have a rational view of things, and yet, it says in the Bible, that everything is just a mystery, and even God's folly is smarter than human wisdom, right?
mhm.
And his weaknesses are greater than human strength. So, and
Yeah, I love this passage from First Corinthians 1, some of my favorites.
yeah, they are. Yeah, it's been fun. Um, so what about you? What's your next paper? What's your next focus?
Yeah, so AI is not my only focus. I'm working on a lot of stuff that has very little to do directly with AI. But I am working on this question of moral motivation, actually, and and how debates about human moral motivation affect how you would think about uh, moral motivation of artificial agents. So some philosophers think that, if you understand moral truths, if you understand what is morally good, what is morally required, merely understanding those things will lead you to have some sort of moral motivation, to care about it, to be somewhat invested. I mean, you might have contrary motivations too, but that moral motivation arises out of a kind of understanding of moral truths. Um, this thesis is called motivational judgment internalism. The idea is like merely understanding moral truths leads to some sort of motivation to be moral.
Mm.
I don't necessarily agree with that view entirely, although I take it seriously. But what I'm doing is exploring what implications that has for AIs. So if an AI then was capable of understanding moral truths, then maybe you would think the AI would then have some sort of internally generated motivation to act morally, which could be a good or a bad thing. I mean, it might be good in the sense that you could imagine an AI that has moral understanding resisting the pernicious programming from some bad actor because it's motivated in virtue of its moral understanding to do the right thing, right? And if it's programmed by some bad actor, if it's given an aim of doing the wrong thing, it would have some tendency to resist that directive, right? Um, on the other hand, if AIs were capable of coming up with their own motivation just through understanding certain truths about morality, then if they have the wrong views of morality, they also might be motivated to follow what they take to be moral and what we might not think is moral. And we might see this as a problem if AIs were capable of generating their own motivations apart from motivations that are just kind of given to them in their programming. And so, part of what this paper is getting into is motivation something that arises in a system in virtue of understanding, in which case the motivations of a machine would be somewhat at least out of our control. Or is motivation just something that's kind of completely independent of understanding? You can give it all the understanding you want and then give it whatever motivations you want, and you can combine any sort of degree of understanding with the motivations that you've chosen to program in. Um, and I'm at least open to the view that some kinds of moral understanding, really understanding not just that something is morally required, but why it's required, why it's good. That understanding alone is sufficient to give us some motivation to respond to it morally, to respond to it with the right sort of care. In which case, it may be that we don't have the power to just fully control a genuinely intelligent AI, would have some motivations that are outside of our control. That's
I
the
guess,
paper I'm looking at. It's exploring both sides of this sort of debate. But
yeah, I guess the question would be, I guess what's good? That's the one thing. What is good? What are the good standards? And then the other is when you code in motivation, I guess that you motivate based on incentives. So what are the incentives structures around to motivate
yeah,
that would be significant, right? What are
yeah.
incentives?
Those who like this internalist view would generally say just recognizing that something is good, you don't need some extra motivation to be good. Like that is motivating in itself, that we are recognizing that something is admirable or beautiful or good as creatures who really understand what goodness is or what beauty is. Like that alone is motivating. It may not be the only thing that's motivating. Sometimes we want external reward, we want recognition, we want money, we want happiness, all these other things. But among the things that motivate us as beings who really are able to appreciate goodness is goodness itself.
Sure. But here's it, like, let's just say you're a child, you're a baby, and you're motivated, you see your mom and that is pure joy and pure
mm,
goodness. And
mhm,
but you're constantly attached to your mom and you never let her go because she's pure joy.
mhm,
Mom says, no, honey, you got to learn how to be independent, be on your own. But you're like, no, but you're pure goodness. So I always want to be part of you. I mean, I think just learning those cues, maybe there is a world in which they learn like a baby, they grow up and they learn the social cues and that it doesn't happen magically, but
mm.
I'll give it just
You mean like where an AI grows up and where we,
string. back to big, we just self-destruct. We just let them take control. I don't know.
No, I didn't know quite where you were going with the baby analogy. What was your aim? What was
I'm
your
just
point there?
saying that, just you were saying that some people say that if something is good, that'll motivate us to just, if we see something as good, that'll motivate us
Hmm.
to do the right thing. And so I was just thinking about, you look at your mom, you want to be with your mom, or your kid,
Hmm.
your kid, you think your kid is good and you want to do everything for your kid. And then all of a sudden you become this, what do they call it? Helicopter lawnmower parent, right?
Yeah,
It's like the things that you think are you could do too much good.
sure.
That there's such a thing as too much compassion, right? There's, at some point you're lying to someone if you're
Mm.
just compassionate to them and not telling them that they're doing the wrong thing. All of those complicated things, maybe AI or maybe they can learn this over time in situations, or they can be coded in all these different situations. But yeah, anyway, that good luck on that paper. Maybe we'll have to have a conversation again, but it sounds fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely in progress. I presented at a conference this last summer, but quite a ways to go to get it fully worked out.
All right. Well, John, thank you. I feel a lot more smarter, and it's really great to talk to people who are interested in this stuff and really trying to really bridge this conversation between, faith and religion and technology and AI. So, thanks again for spending time with me.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated the way you pushed me to be clear and pushed me to defend points that you might have disagreed with, but it was a good conversation.
This was great. Thank you. I've been speaking with John Pittard. He's the Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion at Yale Divinity School. I'm Bambi Francisco Roizen. You've been listening to CRT.